Look, Taylor, a better view. Anyway, this video is about...
Yeah, just get to it. In 2020, the mystery of vitamin D was solved. And I'm here to tell you the truth about vitamin D is stranger than you would have ever guessed. The story starts thousands of years ago because vitamin D connects to opioids in our brain. I'll pause a moment for you to think about that. This little supplement is directly linked to powerful painkillers that make us feel euphoria. In fact, the biological link is so magical, it actually predicts who will become addicted to opiates and how it can be used to treat those who already
To the
are.
story of Robert Downey Jr., drugs land the troubled actor in prison.
This video will explain how that's possible. Because it turns out the sun is an ancient opiate. And we're only today starting to understand entirely what that means. But buried deep inside our brain, scientists found a code that can switch sunshine into morphine. And you may not believe me, but over the course of this video, I will spend months making my body addicted to the sun, and then use Narcan to put myself in opioid withdrawal from vitamin D dependency. So stay with me, because fully understanding the mysteries of vitamin D will improve your life. But its benefits are also tangled up in a complex system of addiction and reward that trace back to the beginning of our evolutionary tree and DNA. But in order to change your opinion on vitamin D, first I think I need to tell you the story of how I got my body addicted to the sun. Heliophilia. Noun. The desire to stay in the sun. Love of sunlight. An addiction to the sun.
After spending 2 months in the sun, I am now definitely a heliophile. My mood is up when the sun is out, and down when it's gone. After 20 minutes in the sun, I feel energized, excitable. Like I want to post on Instagram, tweet, call friends. It's bizarre. Dr. Bunch. And when I don't get sun, I've noticed my mood is irritable. The behaviors I'm describing are true, but also fascinating. Like if a psychiatrist examined me, they would say I exhibit a sun addiction, which sounds funny, but that's what I want to test. And in order to do that, I need to expose my body to as much UV light as possible.
The truth is, many of us already have a relationship with the sun, but we don't confront it because the seasons act as a natural taper. Autumn is a 12-week titrate, and if you're healthy, you enjoy Thanksgiving. If you got addicted, well, you're debating a move to Miami. But dichotomously, an opioid addict can reduce their cravings by moving to a place with a lot of sunshine. The question is why and how? Scientists have known for a long time sunshine is composed not only of visible light, for which we wear sunglasses, but also invisible UV light that burns our skin. For decades, dermatology has viewed UV as a pesky, invisible radiation that causes skin cancers. And that's true, but they've also spent billions in public awareness and sunblock to eradicate our exposure to it when we're outside, dismissing it as nothing more than a nuisance to healthy skin. However, this may be viewed as a colossal error, because UV plays mysterious effects on our brain that we previously didn't know about.
Oh, there's a light green glow.
Here's the tedious but important science we must understand first in order to dig deeper into vitamin D's secrets. When you or I sit in the sun, we receive approximately 90% UVA rays and 10% UVB rays. Difference between A and B are subtle but distinct. A rays actually tan skin. A rays do this because they're slower than B and travel further into our dermis layer, and trigger a repair gene called POMC. POMC will be important later on. Unfortunately, A waves are also responsible for most of the melanoma skin cancers. UVB is different. While only 10% of light is UVB waves, they trigger the vitamin D production necessary in our bodies. But because B waves are faster than A, they don't tan our skin. They immediately start burning it. A weird byproduct of this is the sunblocks we buy usually only block UVB, which is not good for our vitamin D production. Now, normally we never notice this difference between UVA and UVB because our bodies evolved underneath the sun. Essentially, while in the sun, our skin reads the incoming A waves and manufactures melanin, and the increase in melanin slows the B waves from burning our skin while we synthesize vitamin D from it. It's why people in Sweden are pale and dark along the equator. Skin color is an evolutionary adaptation to squeeze or deflect the sun to keep each of our vitamin D levels healthy. It's honestly really kind of clever once I learned about it. But while vitamin D deficiency is a recognized health problem, the issue remains far more complex. Because I'm curious about ultraviolet A, the less discussed one, as UVA appears to be a previously unknown narcotic. In 2014, a group of scientists at Harvard published a little notice paper that shows UVA can bind to our opioid receptors. Now, when I first read this, it seemed a little bit odd to me. UVA affects opioid receptors? UVA is sunlight. And beta endorphins? Why had I never heard about this in the news before?
The UV index over the last couple of days was in the high category.
So I tracked down the author of the original paper, a research doctor named David Fisher, and asked him to explain this all to me. Dr. Fisher, do you hear me?
Sitting right next to that area where MSH is endorphin, beta endorphin. So it told us that something opiate was happening after UV radiation, and MSH turned out to be the critical factor.
I'll simplify the conversation. The MSH Dr. Fisher is referring to is melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And through a multi-step process, UVA radiation generates that POMC I mentioned earlier. POMC cleaves into melanocytes to tan our skin, and then beta endorphins. But what Dr. Fisher discovered is these POMC beta endorphins also curiously activate the brain's mu opioid receptors. For comparison, H and F produce their euphoria and analgesia by using these same mu opioid receptors, and it appeared superficially UVA from sunlight could generate an opioid effect on the brain. But how powerful was UVA's effect? Dr. Fisher didn't know, so he decides to run some tests with mice.
Is that just coincidence, or could this actually be significant? Decided to embark on experiments to ask whether endorphin might actually produce any behavioral effects from UV radiation.
So here's what Dr. Fisher and his team do. They take mice and expose them to a UV amount equal to a human standing in ambient Florida sun for 20 minutes every day for 6 weeks. And here's where things get weird. After 1 week, significant elevation of these POMC beta endorphins are observed in their plasma. After 2 weeks, the mice begin to show symptoms of opioid usage. And by week 3, they even develop strop tail, which is a classic symptom of morphine intoxication. So what's going on? Well, next, Dr. Fisher and his team decide to do something clever. The mice were definitely mimicking opioid intoxication, but if UVA is creating a real opioid effect in the body, then the mice should respond to Narcan. So you understand, EMTs use Narcan to rescue overdoses. In fact, it's so powerful, it not only revives an overdose, it will put a person into opioid withdrawal.
You just almost fucking died.
So to test the opioid effect, Dr. Fisher injects the mice with Narcan. And boom, wet dog shake, paw tremor, teeth chattering. The Narcan put mice into physical opioid withdrawal after they were overexposed to ultraviolet light.
That it's an opiate response that has addictive propensity in it.
So what does this mean? Well, it points to UVA being a drug that works very slowly and through the skin, but ultimately with continual exposure creates an effect on the brain very similar to other opioids like morphine. Which is wild, but time for a personal story. I'm a heliophile now, and that's partly to prove the hypothesis of this video. But in fact, I spent most of my life not in the sun. Here's where I grew up. That's me, that's the car. My hometown is in Michigan, where it snows like Sweden, is overcast from November to May, and bitterly cold. In fact, I think I still have some frostbite. As a kid, I didn't think much about the sun, but I did think about something else at 16 that is relevant. I thought about these. I loved these. Everyone I knew in school loved these. To put it bluntly, I was quickly becoming opioid dependent in high school. And it's not like my life was bad. I felt like there was a void, and those filled it. And everyone I knew had the same void with the same fix. But now I wonder if part of the reason why that void existed was the sun. Did my friends and I enjoy particularly opioids because of our geography? Like if we had grown up in Arizona, would the story be different? Because Dr. Fisher's research shows that after 6 weeks of daily sun exposure, mice develop outward symptoms of opioid use, a measurable cross-tolerance to morphine, and can be put into withdrawal, the next question that comes to me is, does the sun create the same effect on humans? And would a lack of sun make opioid addiction more easy? Because anecdotally, I know sun-devoid communities, whether it's San Francisco or the famous Kowloon walled city, were notorious for their extremely high opioid use. I'm wondering if there's like a Venn diagram of people who are vitamin D deficient and then are also more susceptible to opioid use, opioid addiction, because they're vitamin D deficient.
You could have been working in my lab, because this is exactly what is in our study. And again, I can't really tell you everything we found, but I will share that I'm very enthusiastic about this.
So while Dr. Fisher wishes to remain coy about his ongoing research, I found a separate study that indicates a troubling secret. When using the DSM-4 on 150 beachgoers, half met the criteria for addiction. Displaying drug-seeking behavior, an inability to stop, and a rearranging of life to continue tanning in beds. Why? Well, could it be the weird opioid effect we saw in mice presenting itself in humans that like to tan frequently? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. After all, humans are a lot larger and more complex than mice. I'm willing to entertain social status and aesthetic are driving human behavior more than anything else. But at this point, I got to work.
Totally my pleasure.
All right, thank you, Dr.
Great.
Fisher.
Nice talking to you.
After speaking with Dr. Fisher, I began poring over medical journals looking for any more information on this mysterious UV effect. And after months, I found a tiny study. It's only one page, but the report is relevant. In 2005, 17 years ago, a doctor named Mandeep Kaur was studying tanning compulsion in New York. She was a struggling resident attempting to reduce tanning in her patients and tried a melange of treatments.
My name is Trisha, and I can't stop tanning.
But what got me interested is Kaur randomly gave 3 frequent female tanners Naltrexone prior to their weekly tanning session. And after administration, the report documents 2 out of the 3 women felt disoriented and unable to concentrate. They then developed nausea and later vomited. This immediately appeared like opioid withdrawal to me when I read it, and Kaur actually noted the same thing. The women developed symptoms similar to opioid withdrawal, but were not on opioids. She speculated could tanning beds be having some mysterious opioid effect, but wrote she had no further knowledge. However, 1 year later, It seems Carr couldn't leave the question alone, because in 2006 she prodded again. This time she set up a randomized double-blind controlled trial. She gave naltrexone to 6 frequent tanners and 6 non-tanners to see if it decreased their enjoyment of tanning. The result? They actually had to stop the study because half of their frequent tanners got violently sick from the naltrexone. Just like the mice, this points to UVA and vitamin D synthesis acting as a mysterious opioid in our brain. So 17 years ago, Dr. Carr quietly observed naltrexone makes otherwise normal humans who tan frequently get sick, even though they're not on opioids, but didn't know why. Then, 10 years later, Dr. Fisher comes along and discovers Bonci and provides the missing link.
That it's an opiate response that has addictive.
It turns out Dr. Carr's observations were correct. UV radiation is a mu-opioid agonist, like morphine or oxycodone. And not only were Carr's patients mimicking opioid withdrawal, they were in literal opioid withdrawal from over-tanning, but nobody knew about it, and the science got buried. But after discovering this, Dr. Fisher is optimistic we are perhaps on the potential to radically change addiction therapy.
I believe this is sort of the tip of a very interesting iceberg that even starts entering the world of, public health and opioid addiction.
But Dr. Carr's little report was almost 20 years ago, and since then, there's been no case studies on naloxone and UV in humans, which is why I decided to take what we know now and experiment on myself. Finally time to hit the Narcan. I just got finished up, as you saw, with the tanning salon. Just leaving the tanning salon now. I'm looking very burnt here, because I wanted even more extra UV rays. Really push this to the max. I've never been more golden brown in my life. Okay, before we go further, for my more academic viewers, to replicate the study from mid-May to mid-July, approximately 2 months, I exposed myself to 20 to 40 minutes of ambient New York sun between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. every day without sunscreen. The average UV index was a 5. Plus, I also used a tanning bed 4 times for 10 minutes each, which breaks down to once every 2 weeks. And I did this under the consult of multiple doctors who all said doing this once, given my age and health, was unlikely to lead to any trouble. Got an extra. 3, 2, 1. It's making my nose tingle. Okay, currently don't feel anything. Nothing. It's only been a few seconds. Give it a minute or two. I'm not feeling anything, so I begin reading the directions in case I did it wrong, and then right around here is when it hits me. First in my leg. My legs. I feel like there are iron bars in my leg all of a sudden. So my legs feel restless, and then I start sweating and yawning for no reason badly. This is way more intense than I anticipated. But after 30 minutes, I begin to feel extremely out of it. Like I don't know what's going on. And then suddenly my stomach feels sick. In fact, I gotta get up. My legs, I don't feel well. Okay. My heart is beating so rapidly here. Look at my eyes. They're so dilated. Thankfully, an hour and 30 minutes left to go, according to the physicians I spoke to. Said this only lasts 2, 3, 4 hours tops, has a short half-life. I think I'm gonna try to go for a run. So I'm convinced the connection between UVA and opioids is now definitely real, and admittedly a little scary. Your boy got shook. In fact, Dr. Fisher's link between sun and opioids was damning enough. I found out a few scientists have begun wondering about the inverse, and something I was thinking about all along. Does a chronic lack of sun cause a void in the body's natural endogenous opioid levels? And therefore, when synthetic opioids are introduced to the body, make the person more likely to abuse them, because they refill their drained natural baseline. If it's true, it means sun exposure, or lack thereof, directly affects the opioid epidemic. And one of the researchers asking that question is the famed Italian Dr. Bonci, the former chief scientist for the NIH and director at NIDA.
Dr. Bonci. All right, thank you.
Of course. In terms of all the different addictions that I can think of, probably this is the one that has probably the least amount of studies. Right. So it's one of the most difficult to begin to understand. So I'm happy that you're interested in just bringing knowledge toward this field, because it's important. We all have friends that say, I would never move to a place where it rains all the time or where it's dark all the time. I would die. But this is all hearsay.
Right.
But I wonder in Scandinavia if there are studies that have actually shown whether during the winter months, for example, the rate of depression or alcoholism or any type of addiction goes up. So we are looking now, Lester, at the flip side, not about the UV seekers, but what happens when you are UV deprived.
Right, deficient, yeah.
Bonci asks a good question. Instead of sunbathers, what happens to those who are sun avoiders? People who chronically don't receive enough vitamin D? Does it affect opioid addiction? Or even possibly make it more likely? Well, while I was Narcanning myself, our friend Dr. Fisher published the research he was being coy about.
I can't really tell you everything we found, but I will share that I'm very enthusiastic about this.
He was able to show sun deprivation does correlate with opioid addiction. At this point, I'm bringing you science as fast as they're discovering it. In 2020, while the world focused on COVID, Dr. Fisher took patients pre-surgery, measured their vitamin D levels as a proxy for natural UV exposure, and then tracked their painkiller use post-surgery. The paper, Preoperative Serum 25-hydroxy blah blah blah, I read it so you don't need to, revealed patients who had lower vitamin D levels essentially used painkillers longer after surgery, used them at a higher milligram level, and more often developed a physical dependence to them. I found this interesting, because if vitamin D can predict opioid use after surgery, I think it's time to imagine big, and ask, does a modern lifestyle of indoor offices, driving cars, sitting at computers, essentially a life empty of vitamin D, affecting addiction at a societal level? The answer is probably yes. Current estimates put 1/3 of Americans at vitamin D insufficient. For decades now, a combination of lifestyle and geographic location may have been secretly priming tens of thousands for opioids. All they needed was the access, and they were hooked. And while no studies have been done to date, I only need to think about where opioid addictions are overperforming per capita in the US. Rainy Washington and Portland, Oregon, overcast Ohio and Michigan. It aligns with what we now know about UV light, vitamin D deficiency, and sun-seeking behavior mimicking opioid-seeking behavior. People are subconsciously seeking UV light because they're vitamin D deficient, but finding prescription painkillers instead and frequently getting hooked.
This data is revolutionary, but it also personally correlates with what my friends and I were experiencing in high school. Friends and I in Michigan were all vitamin D deficient. I'll tell you the rest of the story. I graduated high school fully embracing the painkiller lifestyle, but then something changed. I moved to Kansas for college. I arrived and it was hot and sunny all the time, but I think I might have got lucky because the climate had a radical effect on my mood.
That change in my mood is noteworthy because I have one last paper. Only a few months ago, Dr. Fisher demonstrated vitamin D actually regulates the power of opiates. Let me repeat that. Changing vitamin D levels changes the effect of opioids. It literally makes them stronger or weaker. For example, when mice become vitamin D deficient, the brain will increase their physical sensitivity to opioids. And when healthy vitamin D levels are restored, the brain decreases the sensitivity to opioids. We're not sure how the brain does this yet. The effect is measurable. Why the brain does this is more simple and historical. These sensitivity upticks are an evolutionary adaptation from thousands of years ago. The brain needed to expose the body to UV to make vitamin D to keep living, so it made vitamin D absorption feel extra pleasurable when it wasn't getting it. And because UV light is a mu opioid, when we consume synthetic opioids while low on vitamin D, the body gets deceived. It falsely thinks it's getting vitamin D even though it's not, and continues to reward that addictive behavior.
This behavioral inclination, you're living in Scandinavia 10,000 years ago, and in all winter long it's dark and it's freezing cold. You're living in a cave and you feel miserable there. There is a biological, organically, genomically encoded pathway that makes you feel better if you come out and worse if you stay in the cave. But if you stay in the cave, you probably will die. I love the way you think. I really, you have a great mind for this.
Unfortunately, a long time ago, our bodies secretly married UV light and opioids together to force us into the sun to synthesize vitamin D. But today, this evolution is ripe for hijacking. It appears to be sleepwalking us into addiction. UV is an opioid in the brain, and lack of vitamin D amplifies the brain's response to any opioid, including painkillers. And there are millions of Americans who are vitamin D deficient. Therefore, the first thing we can do to decrease opioid addiction is increase our vitamin D levels through supplements or sunshine across society.
Like, let me show you something interesting. This is a map that shows mean sunshine hours per state. Notice how opioid use seems to track particularly the 35th parallel. If it were poverty alone, we should see use remain strong from Appalachia down through Mississippi and Alabama. But instead it dries up. I think it's the increase in sunny days that's secretly accounting for the change.
Like all things, vitamin D and UV can be cleverly abused or systematically used to improve our future, but we have to decide which it will be. This video isn't really the end. It's not exhaustive on all the mysteries of vitamin D, nor even able to address the unique nuances UV has on people of color. Really, this video is only the beginning. But it was Karl Marx who said religion is the opium for the masses. But I think he was wrong. It's vitamin D that's the real opium for the masses. It always has been. We're just waking up to it now.
So, what did we learn? Well, I'm not entirely clear. But what I do know is I feel great.
I can't see you.